The Right Side with Doug Billings.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to The Right Side. Doug Billings here. For those of you in Kansas, it's your favorite candidate for governor right here. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, child sex trafficking is a scourge upon this country. It's an evil that must be addressed. We've got to say this out loud. No other candidate in the state of Kansas, at least, is talking about this as they should be. This is a crime. This is an evil that takes place in every zip code in our country. And so today, a group called Guard Against Trafficking, their website, guardagainsttrafficking.org, Dr. Jarrod Sadulski and Ali Hopper. Ali Hopper is the president of Guard Against Trafficking. Dr. Sadulski is the vice president of that organization. Today, part one in a two-part series that I'm doing on human and child trafficking. What it is, what is grooming, because that's a big component that's often left out of this discussion, and how we can change and amend our state legislatures and legislation to better enable us to prosecute and lock up these animals, which is something that I've pledged to do day one of my governorship, an executive order creating the Child Human Sex Trafficking Task Force, and I will empower the Kansas Highway Patrol, the Kansas National Guard, to go after these savages who perpetrate these crimes. And I'll ask the Attorney General to get the KBI, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, involved in this as well. So all of this very important, and it's one of my campaign pillars. I'm going to shine a light on that today, part one of my look at the horror of child and human trafficking in the United States and in Kansas. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, The Right Side with Doug Billings is now upon you. Are you ready? Let's go.
Hey everybody, my name is General Mike Flynn, and I'm here to do a big shout out for my great friend and one of the best in the business, Mr. Doug Billings. Right Side with Doug Billings, Right Side with Doug Billings. Doug is the future of the airwaves when it comes to independent broadcasters and podcasters. He is the new Rush Limbaugh. He's exactly what America needs right now, looking for honesty, looking for wisdom, looking for truth, looking for patriotism. Listen to Doug Billings at Right Side with Doug Billings. God bless you and God bless America, and thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are winning. We're winning, winning, winning. Welcome to The Right Side with Doug Billings. Are you ready?
We are not liberal snowflakes who melt away in the face of tragedy, adversity, and challenge. We are a covenant nation under God, and His divine providence is not dead and it's not gone. It is living within each and every one of you. And you will bring it to life in such a way that the world has never seen before. We never back down. We never give up. We march forward.
Hi, everybody. Okay, welcome back. Here we go. As I said, we have Dr. Jarrod Sadulski and Ali Hopper with guardagainsttrafficking.org. That's their website, guardagainsttrafficking.org. We're going to have that on the screen throughout the interview. Here are an example of two people doing God's work. What we need to not only make people aware of, but the work that they do to protect children, child human trafficking in general in the state of Kansas and throughout the country is very important. This has, obviously, as you can all imagine, you've heard me talk about this on this show before, national impact. Child sex trafficking, child and human trafficking happens in every zip code in this country. Don't let anyone try to tell you that that's not true. It's an epidemic of evil. We're out to root it out. It's part of the pillars of my campaign as I run for governor. And in full transparency, you all know that. I launched this show 5 years ago, but you know now that I'm running for governor of the state of Kansas, and this is a key pillar. I've promised you that on day one, there will be an executive order that will create a child human trafficking task force. I'm going to engage the Kansas State Highway Patrol and the Kansas National Guard. We're going to hunt down the animals in Kansas and shut down their corridors who do this, and we're going to hold them accountable to justice. So having said all of that, I would like to bring on Dr. Jarrod Sadulski and Ali Hopper to tell you about Guard Against Trafficking, the legislation that they help various states accomplish. And I've asked them to take a look at Kansas legislation as well to find loopholes. We have laws in Kansas that guard against this, but there are loopholes, and they're experts in finding those loopholes and then helping us close them. So Dr. Jarrod Sadulski, Ali Hopper, welcome to the program.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Everything is great. We appreciate you taking the time to do this. Why don't you tee this up for us? Explain to us. I'm going to just let you explain the story. How did Guard Against Trafficking come about? What you do, what you think, what are the goals of the organization, and how, from a very high level, what you've done to help other states lock down their legislation that may already exist, or in some cases may not have existed, to help guard children and other people against this terrible, evil scourge that we have in this country.
Sure. So Allie and I started working together about a year and a half ago, and we were engaged with human trafficking. We went to prisons, went to a prison in Central America to speak to incarcerated cartel members that were involved in human trafficking. And what they told us was horrifying. So then we did our research. We did a research at the border, went both into Mexico as well as on the US side of the border. And again, what we found was horrifying. And then we've been traveling around the country, researching human trafficking, speaking to countless victims, and gaining a deeper understanding of how bad human trafficking really is in our country. And we'll definitely share that with you today and what it looks like. And a lot of people don't really understand human trafficking. Human trafficking is anytime somebody is forced into some type of labor and can't leave. So it could be sex trafficking, it could be domestic servitude, it can be any form of forced labor, agriculture, which I know is big in Kansas. So anything that a person is unable to leave because somebody is controlling them. Perhaps they control their passport and identification, they control their money. Then those are people that are trafficking victims. And
Can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
As you said when you were down there, Dr. Sadulski, I rarely interrupt, but when you said that you went down there and what you found was horrifying, what's an example of that? Is this what you're talking about? Children that are forced into labor and other such things? Is that what you meant when you said
Absolutely.
that?
There's a lot to unpack there. One of the things that first comes to mind is when Allie and I were on the border in a place called Yucumba, California. We were on a property that was an old abandoned gun range, and there was a property manager that lived there, and he explained that there's two paths on his property. One path is where people are being brought to the United States by the cartel, where they're coming from countries of wealth. There's no signs of exploitation on that path. But he explained there's the other path, the poor path. And those are the people that are often coming from Central and South America. And he said that he hears the screams of adults and children being sexually assaulted on a consistent basis. In fact, 2 nights prior to our arrival, he heard somebody being sexually assaulted on that trail. And we said, well, you have to show us the trail. So, I'll spare your audience the gory details, but I can tell you that Allie and I walked that trail into Mexico, and there were signs of sexual exploitation of women and children, very young children, throughout that path. And that's just one of the many things that we found that were horrifying. And Allie, as a Hispanic mother, can share her perspectives on what she saw.
And that, I appreciate that. And I have been to the border, and I've seen what they call rape trees down in southern border, where the children's and women's and sometimes boys' clothing hung in these trees as kind of a grotesque trophy as to what has been going on down there. So the audience has heard me call that out before, and I appreciate you coming. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Allie. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. I mean, you're exactly right. There were rape trees. We encountered a rape van. There are numerous abandoned houses that are along the border that they're just littered with drugs, signs of sexual assault and abuse. So we actually experienced and saw those things. Now, our trip was during the prior administration. It was during the Biden-Harris administration when the border was wide open, and we saw numerous border crossings in broad daylight with no concern for Border Patrol agents. We had a border crossing in broad daylight where we saw a masked cartel member flash us a peace sign. And when they wait for Border Patrol to show up, calling them migrant Uber, knowing that they're just going to transport them onto their next location, their next destination on our taxpayer dollars, it shows a complete disregard for our laws, for our law enforcement, for our Border Patrol agents, and for our nation. And that was under the previous administration. We would see unaccompanied children crossing. There were circumstances where both Jarrod and I saw children actually present us with the same Post-it note or piece of paper with the name, address of who they're supposed to request to be their sponsor. Many times, they would say that they didn't even know who the person was, but they were just supposed to request this individual, this location as their end destination. And so it really is horrifying to see under the prior administration, the complete lack of disregard for our nation, our policies, our national security. And when you go to the border and you see just documents strewn throughout about how to get around Border Patrol, how to navigate requesting certain NGOs, how to utilize certain systems and services within the United States, to provide cell phones, housing, food, basic necessities. These are guides, how-to guides for illegals crossing into the United States, and how they can expect to be supported and taken care of. Now, with this new administration, with the Trump administration, the border has been completely shut down. So the cartel has needed to figure out other ways to get into the interior of the country, of which Jarrod can go into more of the tunneling system. But in the meantime, this administration is working tirelessly to get out the criminals, the bad actors, the cartel members, the terrorists out of the country, and focusing on getting them to their home country and working with other countries to ensure the safety of our country. So did you want to go into the tunneling system?
Sure. So, as I mentioned previously, we speak to cartel members that are incarcerated, and I want to kind of explain how that process occurred. So 6 years ago, I went down to a country in Central America to provide human trafficking training to their government, and part of that experience was a tour of their prison. Their prison has one of the lowest reoffending rates in the world and has basically systems in place that are truly working to rehabilitate these inmates. And I was so taken back by what I saw that for the last 6 years, I've been leading missions teams down to this prison to provide the only training that the staff and the inmates receive. And we provide for the inmates life skills training, how to be a father while you're incarcerated, that type of training. Well, some of those inmates are in there for human trafficking, and some of them are former traffickers themselves. And they've explained to us, or we've explained to them, that they can't do anything about the victims they exploited, but as part of the rehabilitation, by talking to us, we can protect future victims. And some of us, or some of them, have just opened up our eyes to things like organ harvesting, things like, how the U.S. policies under the last administration has opened up the floodgates of child trafficking into the United States. And we spoke to one individual who was a former cartel member, sex trafficker, and enforcer in a stash house. And he explained that stash houses work in a series of three. So the first stash house is a processing center. He said that victims of human trafficking are brought to the border, taken to the first stash house, they're photographed, and they're basically, a file is created on them. They're often brutalized as a form of coercion and control. Then they're sent to the second house. The second house is where the actual exploitation occurs. The problem is that second house isn't at the border. That second house is in Kansas. That second house is in Florida. That second house is, as you mentioned, in communities throughout the United States. That's absolutely correct. And they're forced into those trafficking situations until their debt is paid. And if they survive, then they're taken to a third house. That's where they're basically given their property back and arrangements are made to their final destination. So Al and I went into Mexico, into Tecate, Mexico, about a year ago, and we were there in a park, and a cartel member came up to us and asked what our business was in Mexico. And we explained that we're humanitarians. We're simply here, trying to figure out, the situation with the children. Fortunately, not all cartel members are involved in child trafficking. There's what's called the old guard and new guard. It's the new guard that's primarily responsible for child trafficking. The old guard, the old cartel members, they're strictly in this for drugs and arms, and they're not interested in trafficking children. In fact, they despise the cartels that traffic children. So we were fortunate in that we came across the right cartel. He explained to us, he goes, if you look around, every parent is holding the hand of their child. And he said, you know why? And we said, no. And he said, because of the last administration, the market for children being sold in the United States was so high, he said, that a motorcycle will come along, scoop up that child, and that child by that afternoon will be sold in the United States.
I have to compartmentalize that. I don't see how you deal with that on a daily basis. That is so horrific to consider. I mean, just imagining myself as a parent, seeing my child getting snatched up, and you're powerless, helpless to see that happen.
Doug,
But this is what needs to be said.
Right, Doug, it's so bad that we were in a shelter in McAllen, Texas, and there was a mother who refused to let her child out of her arms. She held this child, and when asked, well, why don't you set your child down? You're safe, you're in a shelter, you're in the United States. She explained that the cartel stole not only all of her belongings, but the other two children she started the voyage with because she had no money for bribes. And that's just two children out of thousands.
And Oops, sorry.
No,
I was
go
just
ahead.
going to say these are the things that Jarrod testified to in front of Congress, in front of the Senate roundtable. I testified in November in front of Congress about these very issues, about these stories, these firsthand experiences. These are things that can't be refuted because they are things that Jarrod and I encountered personally, firsthand, happening right in front of us. And so when we're talking about identities being laundered, when we're talking about unaccompanied children coming through the border with ease and being sent to unvetted sponsors, these are things that we personally experienced. And we actually saw the border littered with identifications. And when we had done some digging, it was so that they could virtually launder their identity, erase their who they were, their home country, and sometimes it was for nefarious intent, sometimes it was to mask a criminal background or terrorist tie, or a tie to a terrorist country, but other times it was just to create a new identity that would be harder to track. And if they got caught, it would be harder to figure out where their home country was for them to be deported back to. And when we spoke with a Border Patrol agent, they said that it didn't matter if their new identification said that their name was Mickey Mouse. That is what got put into the database. That is what our database has. And so when we're looking at a database of individuals that crossed over, it's wrought with false and fake information. So our administration, the Trump administration, has a uphill battle to try and find these bad actors, these cartel members, not only find them, but figure out where their home countries are, unless they're getting sent to a prison in El Salvador or a prison here. But as far as deportation efforts go, they have an uphill battle to sort through that fake and false information. And one of the things that we were discussing with an HSI agent was the notice of concern hotline. Now, this was a hotline that was established to make a call, file a report, that if there was some wrongdoing, that the HHS could look into and investigate. And when the Trump administration took over, they were able to identify that there were 65,000 calls that were reports made that went unaddressed, unresponded to, unanswered from August of 2023 to the inauguration. And so now they're going back through these reports to try and see what was the report alleging, what was the concern. And some of the concerns were, children complaining about stale bread, but other concerns that were reported were sponsors that are trafficking them, individuals that are trafficking them, they're being sexually assaulted, they're being abused. And Jarrod, did you want to go into one of the examples of the report?
Sure. So one of the cases that they found was a child that that had been sent, that was being sent under the last administration, that was being sent to a sponsor, and a case agent for Office of Refugee Resettlement actually went out and did a home study at the home and discovered that the person that was claiming to be the sponsor of this child was adorned in MS-13 tattoos, and there were other members of the household that appeared to be gang members. This person reported that to their leadership, and their leadership decided to override the decision, send the child anyways. Within 3 months, that child was found dead with his pants around his ankles, with an adult male passed out next to him. And that is on the hands of the Biden-Harris administration, which is responsible for government-sponsored, taxpayer-funded child trafficking through the border.
And why is that possible? Because the cartels knew to use our programs and services as transportation hubs to be able to transport these unaccompanied children, these illegal immigrants, to their destination location. And it was on our taxpayer dollars. I mean, they were transporting them via buses. We would see unaccompanied children flying on taxpayer dollars. And the flight attendants that we spoke to said that they would see this numerous times. Children that couldn't even speak English, couldn't communicate, were traveling alone. Very, very young children. And so many situations of which the child would show up, their sponsor would not be there, or they would end up in a wrong location. There was just, mismanagement all over the place. When you're talking about them from them crossing the border, you're talking about the mismanagement within ORR and the NGOs. Then you're talking about the mismanagement in the transportation process. And then you're talking about the mismanagement and lack of accountability and transparency when they end up at the sponsors. It's horrible. And when they end up at the sponsor, the last known location, the last thing that HHS is responsible for is making, I think the maximum is 3 phone calls to the sponsor to verify the well-being of a child. 3 phone calls. That's if they even answer. If they don't answer, then they check that off their list and they're done. But I mean, I don't know what sponsor that if they are trafficking a child is going to willingly admit on the phone to an HHS worker, oh yeah, I'm trafficking this child to pay off their debt to the cartel. But when Jarrod testified at the Senate roundtable, he was sitting next to DCF Secretary Siobhan Harris, and she is out of Florida, which is where we're at. And she had said that she was being stonewalled from accessing information of unaccompanied children that were sent to Florida. The state agencies wanted to do the welfare checks needed, and they were not even able to access the information of where these children went.
The couple of just an observation and then a question for you. So I can corroborate. I've been to McAllen, right where you're discussing, in the border. In fact, I went there a couple of years ago with Tom Homan and another group of folks. Eric Trump was there and some others. But we, in his words, and I thought this was very wise. You've certainly, I'm sure that you've heard him say this, because in Kansas, people assume we're landlocked and that we're not, we're not this huge. There's not a huge problem of this in Kansas because we're not a border state. But Tom Holman said every state's a border state now because of the influx of the cartels, the illegals and so forth. Every state is affected. I've always said it. And I'm like you, Allie and Jarrod, I saw it, when we arrived, when our bus pulled up to the river there at McAllen along the border, we saw the inflatable rafts with people on them going down the river. They see us and they turn and they bank on the other side and they wave and they it's taunting and all of that. But there were children on those boats and my heart just sank. And then we see children who have been rescued, for lack of a better word, from the border, but who appeared to be drugged, who are just out of it and have no sense of where they are. It's just. Again, I have to compartmentalize that during the course of a day. I could not do the brave work that you do. It's incredible. And my question is this. So those are the observations. Am I right when I say that this happens in every zip code and that this is a prevalent, horribly evil condition that exists in every state, every county, every city in some form or fashion or another, or am I exaggerating?
Not at all. So it's been documented that human trafficking exists in all 50 states. And the problem is a lot of victims don't realize they're actually a victim, right? We've spoken to a lot of people that are sex trafficking victims that, got into prostitution, then tried to get out of it, but were controlled by their pimp, thinking that they, in fact, were responsible for this and not recognizing themselves as a victim. So, we're talking about the border, and that certainly has exacerbated things. But the vast majority of sex trafficking victims are U.S. citizens. It's the teenage girl that gets groomed online and ultimately leaves and goes with her trafficker. Can you explain a little bit about grooming?
Yeah, so it is that manipulation with the ultimate intent to gain control, trust of typically it's a minor, but adults can be groomed as well. Sexual grooming is what we're talking about here, but that is typically the process by which this happens. It's no longer the white van that pulls up at a park or a street corner that snatch and grabs a child. It's through grooming, and typically it's either done in person or online. So we have committed to combating grooming. Grooming can lead to sextortion, which is then that interaction online where that trust, again, through the grooming process is built up. And these exploiters tend to use fake or false profiles to gain the trust through the grooming process of the individual they're speaking to, gain access to personal photos or videos, and then extort them. And that's what's happening en masse to our young people across the United States. right?
Absolutely. And this exists in Kansas. I want to emphasize this. We're talking about these unaccompanied children, going back to that a second. So just in fiscal year 2023 alone, 719 unaccompanied migrant children were sent from the border to Kansas. And I could tell you that in our research, we've discovered that 95% of the children that have been sent to the border and out to the unvetted sponsors through the Biden-Harris administration are unaccounted for. And so they're just missing. They're gone. There's no trail to follow. And in Kansas, in particular, there have been thousands of calls received to the human trafficking hotline in Kansas specifically. And so that is going to be a mixture of both domestic trafficking as well as trafficking coming from the border.
Well, as I look at this, and as a candidate for governor, what are your, and we're gonna do a part two, and I've explained this in the beginning of our program today, but as we look at the national problem here, governors in various states. I know you've done work in Florida, Iowa, Georgia, et cetera, et cetera. I plan to fully work and cooperate with Tom Holman, ICE, Kristi Noem, and the Department of Homeland Security, all of it. And to, again, as I said at the beginning of this show, to order the Kansas State Highway Patrol and the National Guard to crack down and hunt these people down. Is that, along with your legislative reviews and so forth, the right thing to do? What's your recommendation to curtail and to stop and to save these children?
Well, Florida did something very similar recently. ICE was able to deputize certain law enforcement agencies to be able to act on behalf of ICE to be able to assist with these operations. It's going to be really important, as the focus is to get out the criminals, the bad actors, the terrorists, the traffickers, to get them out of the country. And then by extension, they're going to reassess and start to get out other illegal aliens by, those that have received final notice to appear, those that have extended their visas, stuff like that. But it is exactly what states should be doing. Instead, you see states like blue states that are hindering the ability of ICE to be able to operate. So not only are they're not expected to cooperate. They absolutely should. They should be prioritizing those that their constituents that they represent. So they should be assisting ICE, but at a minimum, they should not be interfering with ICE operations. They should be getting out of the way, letting ICE do their job, and not hindering their ability to do so. And when you see certain states that are shielding and protecting these criminals, when you see a illegal alien like Garcia that gets deported to El Salvador, and you see all of these lawmakers flying down to El Salvador to advocate for a criminal, a human trafficker, allegedly, according to him being caught for potentially labor trafficking. But they're advocating for these people instead of who they should be advocating for. Who should they be advocating for? Their constituents, the families that are struggling to put food on the table, the children that need to be protected, the veterans that need assistance, the homeless. We need to start advocating for those that we are elected to represent, and not the illegals and the criminals and the bad actors that are in this country. So like you said, Kansas should be using all of their tools, their agencies at their disposal to assist with these operations. But at a minimum, no state should be hindering ICE's ability to do what they need to do to ensure the security of this country.
Right on, Allie. Well said and well met. And I forgot to mention the KBI, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, which also reports into the governor's office. So we've got the State Highway Patrol, the National Guard, and the KBI, just to name a few, that report right into the governor's office that will be used, if I'm elected, to begin the manhunt for these savages, for these animals. Ladies and gentlemen, Allie Hopper, the president of Guard Against Trafficking. GuardAgainstTrafficking.org is the website. Dr. Jarrod Sadulski is the vice president of that organization. Please go over there to their website, GuardAgainstTrafficking.org, and check it out, and prayerfully consider lending any support and help you can over there. Allie, Jarrod, we've got a few minutes left. I'll give you the last word just to close up this part one. And again, to remind the audience, this is just a kind of a national look and setting the table for what we're going to talk about in part two, which is Kansas specific. issues regarding this topic. So you guys, a couple of minutes just to close it up and give last thoughts on this episode.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for having us on. This is a tough subject to talk about. Not only talking about it, but you have made it a platform issue. These are the things that need to be done to protect our constituents, our communities, our state, and our country. And this is, I commend you for making this a platform item, a key item on your agenda if you are, if you are elected as governor. But really what GUARD focuses on is the research that Dr. Sadulski and I do. Like I said, we do it firsthand in person. It's at the border, it's in Central America, South America, but it's also in the interior of the United States. We do look at domestic trafficking. We do look at other forms of trafficking, not just sex. We look at labor, we look at organ. We examine all aspects of trafficking, many aspects of cartel and gang operations. And we really try and fine tune it with the nonprofit from the research that we are able to find. And then we turn it into educational material, speaking engagements where we're educating community members, parents, law enforcement, lawmakers on our findings, how to protect their families, their constituents, their country. And we also provide consulting and solutions, which is, like you mentioned, advising on certain pieces of legislation to make sure that what we're seeing, what we're encountering, what we're educating people on is able to be incorporated into meaningful legislation that not only looks pretty, but has teeth to it. So that is what I wanted to say about GUARD Against Trafficking, about Dr. Sadulski and I's work. And thank you for having us on.
Excellent. Well
Pretty
said.
tough to
Dr.
follow.
Sadulski.
Pretty tough to follow. She's absolutely right.
Yes.
And Doug, I just really want to say thank you for championing this issue, right? To be willing to make this, part of your priorities with so many things going on. You've selected something that is costing people's lives and they don't have a voice. These trafficking victims don't have a voice, and you are being a voice for the voiceless by championing this issue both on your podcast and in your governor race. So thank you very much, and we really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
You're welcome, both of you. Thank you, Dr. Sadulski. I appreciate it. Allie, look, we are in this together. As far as I'm concerned, I'm at your service. If you need anything from me with regards to this topic and what we can do to help in Kansas and nationally for that matter, I know that we're going to talk more about this in part 2 of this interview, but I look forward to having you come to Kansas and to speak to our legislators and to speak to the KBI and the State Highway Patrol and the National Guard and to educate and train and shine a light on this entire issue. So it is a key campaign pillar of mine. I will be relentless, and I look forward to sharing my day 1 executive order with you that will create a child human trafficking task force to do exactly what we're talking about, to hunt down and stop the horror of what we're talking about here today. So, ladies and gentlemen, once again, guardagainsttrafficking.org. Check it out. This is the end of part 1. We're going to watch, make sure that you watch and listen for part 2, where we're going to get into Kansas-specific legislation to look at what we've got currently and also their assessment on what we can do better in the state. Not placing any blame, of course, on anyone, but just trying to help get Kansas better legislation to protect the children. Until then, ladies and gentlemen, we're in this thing together. Believe it. For the Republic, for Kansas. Cheers.
The Right Side with Doug Billings.